Hello, and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing the second of the iconic Shadow pulp novels, 1931's The Eyes of the Shadow, written by series creator and primary writer Walter B. Gibson under the pen name Maxwell Grant, used for all the stories by Street and Smith. This is very much a direct follow-up to 1931's The Living Shadow, the first of the stories, as there is at least one carryover character in the criminal Steve Cronin who escaped the events of the first Shadow novel and reappears here and will make a later appearance in the series. So already here in the second novel, there is a sense of continuity as there is a sense of time that has passed, plus characters and criminals who even recur from book to book in addition to the Shadow's agents already established. This book is also extremely important for establishing at least two of the major elements of the Shadow's world. This is the first appearance of the key Shadow agent Burbank, who is essentially the radio and communications point man who relays all of the communications between the Shadow and his agents, and is always the mysterious sort of figure behind the controls who everyone has to reach to pass information back and forth. It's also the first appearance of the Lamont Cranston persona, who is often identified as the Shadow's real identity, the wealthy playboy man about town, as described in the radio series. But in the pulp world of the Shadow, this is at first the mysterious sort of dual identity character or real life figure of the Shadow. But even here in the first appearance and all other appearances of the character before things were detailed even further, it is a character who you can't exactly put your fingers on in terms of trying to classify them or understand all of their personality. They seem mysterious and removed from the world and ways, so you can't quite peg them for some reason. Of course, as Shadow fans obviously know, it was eventually revealed that Lamont Cranston was merely an identity that the Shadow took over whenever the real Cranston was out of town, or the Shadow could use the Cranston identity for some particular reason in a case he was working on. It was later revealed that the Shadow's true identity was that of lost famed aviator Kent Allard, who was missing, presumed dead many years before, and so the Shadow, of course, had not one but two other identities, and it's even left up to the reader's interpretation, I think, that perhaps the Kent Allard persona is maybe not the true Shadow in and of himself, as the Shadow will always remain multiple steps ahead of everyone because the Shadow knows. But all of that was to come later, as this was still the second novel, and reading this, you can still very much get the feeling that Walter B. Gibson is sort of feeling his way through the story in terms of setting up various important elements, trying out certain other things, as it's very much a novel where you can feel that it's the start of the series. So, like The Living Shadow, The Eyes of the Shadow is a foundational story. It has elements that aren't quite there or as fully formed in The Living Shadow, and I think overall it has a more consistency of themes and pace to it, whereas The Living Shadow had some really intense highs in terms of action and set pieces. It also had moments where that intensity kind of dropped down to a much lower level. Here in The Eyes of the Shadow, I think overall there's a much more consistent feeling of action and pacing, plus the Shadow makes more out-and-out appearances to confront criminals and evildoers. But it is still only the second novel in the series, and not all of the traditional Shadow elements are quite there, so reading these early books, you can very much get the sense that Gibson is trying things out and moving towards what we will expect from a Shadow novel. So it's not quite at the sort of classic Shadow story yet, but it's a classic in its own right because it's one of the initial foundational stories. But the big thing here is that this establishes the Burbank character and the Lamont Cranston persona, complete with mansion and various household staff members who will also become recurring characters throughout the series. Another thing to note is that this is also a significantly longer book than most Shadow novels, like The Living Shadow was significantly longer. You can even see this when looking at the Sanctum reprints, and you'll note that the page count for some of these earlier books is significantly longer. It's likely due again to this being an early story and a foundational one. And there has been some discussion in terms of shadow fans and historians that these earlier stories have more of a 1920s pulp flavor in terms of they feel almost sort of transitional between the styles of the more sedate and longer, more drawn out stories of the 20s versus the faster paced stories that would start to emerge in the 1930s in terms of pulp magazines. And I think that's a good point to make. I think that's very fitting. And this is 1931 at the start of the very series that would really lead to the explosion of the pulp hero idea and the pulp hero magazine centered around a specific character. And of course, all of this would feed into what would eventually become the golden age of comic books. So everything you come to know and expect from the sort of American superhero character in terms of plotting style, characterizations, tropes, story beats, it can all be traced back to the Shadow Pulp series. And so this being the very start of it is really seeing the initial sort of working out of these story elements. So I think that makes the early Shadow novels even more important and fascinating to study for those reasons. To talk about the plot a little bit, this novel revolves around the proxy hero of Bruce Duncan, who is staying in his deceased uncle's estate and is awoken at the start of the story by a strange vision that might be a dream, or so he thinks, in his terror of some giant, almost ape-like creature stealing into his bedroom at night to open a secret panel in his fireplace and remove some sort of hidden document before escaping. This is a fantastic opening as it has an eeriness of its own and even harkens back at least a little bit to Poe's famous Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's a striking opening that introduces us also to our proxy hero, which is a technique that Gibson would use throughout the stories as you needed some sort of new character to hang a particular plot on, and then this character would eventually interact with the Shadow's agents and sometimes the Knight of Darkness himself. The plot that emerges is that Duncan's uncle was tasked with distributing a fortune to 6 other individuals as part of a long story that runs back many years, and it's a treasure that was earned by these men after assisting various figures in the Russian government. The story hook is that Duncan's uncle is dead, and the documents or information that he was to have used to contact or deal with the 6 individuals who are not named and thus unknown are, of course, what were stolen by the strange, terrifying, ape-like giant creature in the middle of the night from the secret hiding place in the fireplace that Duncan was not aware of at the time. So this puts him in a particular conundrum of trying to not only fulfill his dead uncle's wishes, but also to find this treasure and properly divide it among 6 individuals who are, of course, strangers. And he must do all of this with opposing forces already obviously well ahead of him as they were able to infiltrate and steal the information from its secret hiding place, and thus will be trying to find and stop the other 6 strangers themselves. This is the plot setup that the Shadow and his agents are thrust into, and we see the 2 agents from the first book, Harry Vincent and Claude Fellows, being the ones working the assignment, and of course transmitting messages back and forth with the Shadow in the iconic disappearing ink, and using the office of the secretive, probably doesn't exist, B Jonas figure to receive their orders. But this is expanded upon by introducing the Lamont Cranston character in his estate with his staff, and by also adding Burbank as the major communications operative who works directly for the Shadow. As Duncan and the men who emerge are sort of figures of higher society, that is how Lamont Cranston is able to be brought into the story to investigate further, and it is very obvious that he is the Shadow, although even at this point, though it's not a story element that's really been established, I think the reader can very much pick up on the sort of mysterious energy of the Cranston character, and of course his continual moments of disappearing or getting away from being noticed to then carry out his activities directly as the Shadow. But again, I think the reader can very much pick up on the idea that Lamont Cranston isn't just a dual identity. It seems almost like a character who is not all that he seems for different reasons. So I think even here, in the first appearance of Lamont Cranston, I think the reader can feel there's something slightly off about this character, that it's more of a mask than an actual fully fledged character. So it seems as if Gibson was perhaps already toying with the idea at this point in the second book that perhaps Lamont Cranston was not going to actually be the real identity of the Shadow, and this would eventually get developed into the usage of the Cranston identity, but the true identity ostensibly being that of Kent Allard. So I think it's fascinating to note that even here in the second book, there's already some degree of that ambiguity, which makes the scenes with the Cranston character actually more interesting. Again, because this is only the second novel in the series and is quite foundational in setting up certain elements and playing around with different things, there are some areas where I think there's some rough edges that would be later refined and sort of cleared off as the series progressed and grew. So again, this is very much a series that has to start somewhere and build. Again, compared to The Living Shadow, I think The Eyes of the Shadow is more consistently engaging and does have more bits of action and set pieces scattered throughout than the first book did. But again, it is longer, so there are some points where readers might feel a little bit of lull in the action. So it's these moments where the mystery and atmosphere really take over and are what keep the reader engaged. The whole idea of the fabulous lost treasure and then the various individuals starting to be identified and then all turning up dead in various ways is a wonderful conceit. And then we have a number of really striking moments scattered throughout that really start to give us more of the idea of the Shadow story elements that will emerge further. There's a wonderful sequence where Duncan is trapped in a room that's filling quickly with poison gas, and after escaping from that, he finds himself in an elaborate room that's actually multiple different death traps, and he's only saved by the Shadow's intervening, which we then get to see the Shadow use his incredible abilities to disguise and imitate others to thwart the villain's plans even further. The villain is introduced rather early in the story, so it's not necessarily much of a reveal that this is the ultimate villain, but this main villain of Isaac Crofton is interesting in that he actually manages to escape the events of this book. So he's one of the characters that will recur, and like this book picks up certain elements and characters from the first book, even though it's a different plot, the next novel will continue some of these threads. So it's nice to see that there are some linking threads and elements that start to tie the series together, even at the very start. We also see the first appearance of the sort of speakeasy dive bar, the Black Ship, which is filled with all kinds of the criminal underworld. And this leads to an iconic moment where the Shadow confronts all of them and has a nice action sequence with guns blazing, using the shadows and the atmosphere of the bar to their fullest extent. It's a wonderful moment when the Shadow's booming laugh and mocking voice comes out of the depths of the darkness to confront an entire bar full of armed thugs, and you see them try to not cower in fear before the action ensues. Again, I think the plot and the mystery is well done and more consistently engaging to keep the reader's interest. So that aspect, I think, is showing already improvement over the first novel. And then we build to a really fantastic sequence where Duncan finds himself buried alive. And the climax of that sequence of premature burial is featuring a means of escape that I've never really seen in another premature burial sequence. So that was a nice surprise that wonderful wondering how somebody could escape being buried alive is handled in such a way that actually manages to surprise the reader and befits the Shadow. And if you think Harry Vincent escapes nearly being killed, the climax of the novel finds poor Harry strapped to a medieval torture rack with the villains giving crank after crank. So it looks like poor Harry is going to be ripped in two. Ultimately, I think The Eyes of the Shadow is a very important step forward for the series. I think when you compare this directly to The Living Shadow, it shows a number of direct improvements. The Shadow himself seems like a more active figure throughout the story, even though he makes sporadic appearances. In both books, his presence is always felt, but here it seems like a more consistently engaging plot that, while it may not have quite as dramatic highs as The Living Shadow did, it's also the second book, so it doesn't have to do as much of the foundational work as the first book in the series did. And again, I think you can see Gibson growing as a writer as he expands the world he created in the first book. So I do think there is a nice sense of story progression and a nice sense of world building, even when compared to the first novel. And I do think it is a more consistently engaging read throughout, as the atmosphere and the mystery itself feels completely engaging 100% throughout, and you don't have some of the slight lulls in some of the plot and page count as you do in the first book. But again, I do think you feel that this is an early foundational work, and it is longer than the novels would eventually become. And that's an important point to make in terms of reading it today and looking at the versions that are available, especially in the world of reprints, because The Eyes of the Shadow is one of the Shadow novels that was actually cut down for reissue publication. There was a hardcover book edition with really beautiful cover artwork that was actually taken from a later Shadow novel, but this was actually a reduced version of the original and was then the version that was reprinted when the character saw a sort of resurgence in the paperback adventure boom of the 1960s and 70s. So in 1969, when Bantam published their paperback reprint with this really lovely cover artwork, this was the same edited, cut down version. While I've not read this edition that had edits made, it's possible that this may have actually improved some of the sort of long-windedness of the original version, but this is one of the Shadow novels that you do have to actually seek out the original text, and there's some Shadow novels that only exist in their complete form in the original TypeScript version. And so that's why the Sanctum books reprints are so important, because for novels like this, they are actually restoring the complete original text. And so it's the only major way, in some instances, where you can actually read the full, complete original novel. So I read the novel in its complete form in Sanctum Volume 48, which pairs the novel with the later 1942 novel, The Money Master. That's the one issue with the Sanctum books. If you want to read the series in chronological order, you will have to jump around in terms of the volume numbering. But you do get the best presentation, and in this case, a full restoration of the original text of the second novel. So here on the rear, we have a reproduction of the original pulp cover with the really striking, fantastic disembodied eyes floating around. But of course, as with the first novel, this is a repurposing of an older pre-existing piece of artwork. I believe this was originally on a cover of Detective Story magazine, and due to this being only the second book in the series and needing a cover quickly, they merely repurposed the artwork with the eyes and tweaked it a little bit for its usage in the Shadow magazine. So in the Sanctum reprint, we have the beautiful opening artwork, but this being an early book in the series, this is unfortunately the only artwork you'll find. So that's another thing that links it to The Living Shadow. Inside we have Sanctum's lovely reset typeface, but otherwise perfectly recreating the dual column style of reading the original pulp magazines. And then the book concludes on page 80, which then jumps into the lovely Will Murray interlude essay. The other great thing about each Sanctum volume is you get fantastic historical supplements and critical essays specifically highlighting certain elements about the novels they've paired together. But what makes this volume even more special is that it includes 2 pieces by the creator himself. So this opens with a foreword of material written by Gibson himself, including a lovely autographed photo in full-page reprint, and then concludes with another older vintage piece about Gibson's writing style. So you get not 1 but 2 incredible bits of insight into Gibson's writing process from the man himself directly. And you get an inclusion of the wonderful vintage advertisement for Corona typewriters, displaying just how many words that Gibson cranked out in such an incredible amount of time, and really going into his incredible ability to write at such speed. We then close with the biographical notes on Gibson that are included in most of the volumes of the Sanctum reprints, and then an advertisement for the indispensable Martin Graham's book on the history of the Shadow radio series. So this volume is really what you want to pick up if you're reading the Shadow novels, as this is a full restoration of the original text of The Eyes of the Shadow. The only problem is Sanctum lost the license from Condé Nast to reprint the Shadow novels, and so all of the volumes went out of print and have become very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to actually get on the secondhand used market. So typically you have to hunt high and low for these and try to not pay a significant amount more than the original list price. But I still think they remain the gold standard in terms of pulp magazine reprints, especially for the classic hero characters, and are a treasure to have in terms of the beautiful reproduction of the original novel, the full reproduction of original artwork, maintaining the dual column style, having lovely reproductions of the original covers, including having both of them on the back, plus having the indispensable historical materials, pieces from Gibson himself, and the wonderful historian essays. So ultimately, The Eyes of the Shadow is still an early foundational work for the character and for the series. But if you can read these books back to back in chronological order, I think even here at this very early point of the first 2 books, you can start to see the incredible sense of world building and continuity. And you can get the sense that this is building to somewhere, and that we are getting to the point of the more famous, fully formed Shadow stories. So the fact that these stories are a little bit longer and they may meander a bit, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It's understandable that these stories are this way, and it's really fantastic that we have the opportunity to read them in their full form, beautifully restored like this. The only issue is that the Sanctum volumes themselves are out of print and are becoming increasingly difficult to find. So if you're like me and you're wanting to read the entire Shadow pulp series, the Sanctum volumes are really the versions to seek out, but it will be very difficult to complete a whole set of them. So as always, I hope my babblings about the magical world of the Night of Darkness and pulp fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've gotten the chance to read The Eyes of the Shadow, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, as this is a really satisfying early Shadow story that shows marked improvements and growth over the first book, while also featuring elements that will be key parts of the Shadow's world being used for the first time, and nice linkages to the first and third novels around it. So in some ways, the first 3 books can sort of be considered tied together. As always, please do keep supporting the incredible efforts of the pulp historians, the pulp fan community, and pulp reprint publishers, which are all helping to keep alive the spirit and the importance of this incredible section of American literary history. Please keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely Shadow reprints and hopefully some Sanctum volumes, as they're occasionally able to be found in the wild, but that's easier said than done, given that they've become so difficult to find. Keep enjoying the magical world of pulp fiction, keep reading print books, keep reading in the mystical blue light of the Sanctum, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.